everyone, I'm Tiffany and welcome to the webinar on Partnership and Opportunities in ASEAN, Next Steps for Business, organized by the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry and in partnership with Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them anytime during the webinar by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Now, we apologize in advance if we are not able to answer all questions due to the time constraints. Now, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our Facebook page after editing, and please follow our SMEICC Facebook page to obtain more information and timely updates of our events. Now, in the event of any technical issues happening during this session, we seek your kind understanding for the inconvenience caused, and please bear with us while we rectify the issues. Now, without further ado, let us start off with the webinar on partnerships and opportunities in ASEAN, next steps for businesses. Now, first, let us welcome our speakers for today. We are pleased to have with us Associate Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, SIIA, and Senior Consultant of Wong Partnership, LLP. He will discuss about the impacts of the pandemic, US-China competition, and other current global trends, focusing on the implications for Singapore and ASEAN. Now, we'll also be having Mr. Satya Ramamurthy, Partner and Head of Infrastructure, Government and Healthcare, KPMG and Associate Council Member of SIIA. Now, he will highlight the opportunities that are emerging amidst the pandemic and how Singapore policymakers and businesses can respond. Now, before we start off the session, let us first do a polling questions. Okay, I believe everyone, you can see that there's the first polling questions that's appearing in front of your screen. Now, the question is, how important is the ASEAN market to your businesses? Now, we have three choices. First being very important, second being important, but sharing equal priority as other markets, the third one is not as important compared to other markets. Now, we'll probably give the participants about another 15 more seconds before we end off the session. Okay, and I think we more or less already have the answers already. So let me just end off the poll question itself. Okay, and now without further ado, let us invite Prof. Tay and Mr. Satya over. So over to you, Prof. Tay.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and thank you to SCCCI and your colleagues for joining us on this call. It's my pleasure to start off the talk, and as Tiffany described, I'll do more macro aspects before Satya comes in more on the details of the digital developments in the region and sustainability. I'll go first, and I want to tell you a little bit about how the SIIA sees things. We are a think tank. In fact, we are Singapore's oldest think tank, established some 60 years ago. So we do produce dialogues and analysis which goes to the governments. We've served in the last year as a knowledge partner, the only knowledge partner for the emerging stronger task force by the Singapore government. And we're also proud to say that we've been consistently ranked as one of the leading think tanks in the region, in fact, #1 in ASEAN, and also #1 independent think tank in Asia. But the key part I want to share with you is that we have always been a think tank that tries also to understand how the politics and the economic policies affect businesses. In this sense, we're not so much abstractly about politics or potential conflicts in the South China Sea. We're much more granular about how these things affect or how developments inside countries like Indonesia and Vietnam can impact foreign investors and traders. So with that background, please allow me to begin with how I see the region based on the work we've done. If I could have the next slide, we can see that really we think there are many opportunities coming up in the year ahead. Now, some of us actually joke that it's just we're so fed up of being pessimistic about COVID, we're looking for hope. But I think there is more reality to that. The region is reopening. We've seen the undertakings made by the ASEAN governments around us, including Singapore, but also Indonesia at last year's summit. And in this last few days, we've seen a clear sign from Vietnam, another very big nearby economy, that they are going to open VTLs and try to reopen for business. This is not easy. The Omicron variant is a big question, which I won't run away from. But the current signs are that governments are determined to do so and can approximately manage. This comes, after all, after last year's Delta variant surge, which was quite a severe one for our region. So the governments are not naive, but they are pressured. In many cases, a return to growth is critical for the jobs in the economy and for the balanced books of their finances, which have been drained by the spending during the COVID period. Growth, therefore, should return to our region. There were some who thought the region might be permanently scarred, but I'm pleased to tell you, most of those deep fears seem to be on one side. So long as growth can restart, and most countries around us will grow 4, 6% perhaps, it will, from a lower base of the dip, they'll come back up. This is a good prospect for our region. Singapore, as that hub, should also benefit. Besides the bounce back from the COVID, I would say there are two other factors on the screen to share quickly. There is a very strong geopolitical current, and this is sometimes quite negative when China and America rivalry means that they will put pressure on ASEAN as a group and sometimes try to divide supply chains. I'm sure many of you companies have felt it already. But there is a sense that this crisis also becomes an opportunity. While the South American pressures are there, because companies are looking to move things outside of China, ASEAN, the countries around us, have become even more attractive. So the countries were quite attractive on their own, and with this additional, I don't want to be in China next investment, even the Chinese are coming to Southeast Asia. So I think this is something that we have to understand, while our region has two reasons at least to be optimistic. And the third is that while we have had the severe lockdowns, etc., we've learned to grow through digital. And the digital economy, which used to be nice to have, has become essential. Our institute has looked at these issues more closely, and in these two reports talked about the pandemic up to the Omicron variant, and then about how to try to move ahead. The QR code is there for you to use if this is of more interest to you. Otherwise, let me please move on to the next point. And this is that really we are at the cusp of not just surviving the surge of Delta and now Omicron, but really trying to find ways to live with these ongoing waves of difficulties. That each country is trying to figure out how to keep those travel lanes, those trade lanes continue open. And some countries really need to. Tourism will be a beneficiary, compared to the last few years. I think that the number of jobs, the number of multipliers in the domestic industry, especially for Bali or for the whole of Thailand, these have really begun to be understood by the policymakers. There will be some uncertainties. This December was very evident of that. Promises were made, sometimes shifting the goalposts as we travel. There will be some policy uncertainty, ups and downs, but by and large, we feel the overall direction towards opening is set. Similarly, for supply chains, they have been quite resilient and they will continue to be under strain. So you see costs running up, not because of pure demand in itself, but the inelasticity of supply chains to keep up with the surge of demand in some sectors, perhaps the one for chips being the most clear. This will play into countries and companies that can deliver. Singapore, as one of the busiest ports and busiest logistics hubs, isn't free from these problems. But we feel that we understand the problem, and given the efficiencies of the past, are better placed to deal with these new challenges than a lot of other places. In this sense, this is becoming a real test of quality. Connected to that, the big challenge is upgrading and transformation. In some ways, many of us still hanker for the days before the pandemic. It takes us constantly to remind ourselves there probably is no going back exactly the way it was. And rather than feeling nostalgic about the past, we need to mentally gear ourselves up to find that upgrading or transformation of the economy. And I think this really will help the ASEAN recovery. I mentioned how we have worked with the Emerging Stronger Task Force. I'm not a government member, but I'm happy to tell you that I believe the government is trying to listen. Rather than purely public-private partnerships where they lead, increasingly the Emerging Stronger Task Force is emphasizing private-public partnerships where private sector initiatives or alliances can take the lead and ask government how to shift various incentives, rules, etc., to enable profitable and beneficial economic activity. Particularly, we see this in the digital economy and sustainability. I'm happy to leave this more to Satya to discuss or chip in myself in question and answer. But let me just say these two are no longer just nice to have. They're not PR. They really are coming to the core of people's businesses. Investors are asking decisions about both these things, capacity of companies. So will your supply chain partners. And so from many angles, these demands are now much more real than they were 3 years ago as we entered the pandemic. I think I've got 1 or 2 more slides. The implications for the Sino-American tensions are not over. When Donald Trump stepped down or lost the election, I should say, we heaved a sigh of relief because of the way he conducted it. But in a way, President Biden and his team are pressing on the case in a much more studied way. They have already come up with some non-China alliances like Quad and AUKUS. And we expect they'll come back to the region economically, but not in any deal that brings in either China or free trade. They'll be around, but talking about digital economy and other things. Practically speaking, though, I think every sign is that the American private sector is looking to ASEAN and our small country as a node of growth for them. So I think that this is all, in a way, the silver lining to the dark cloud of Sino-American competition. Even if we cannot wish away the storm clouds, we can find some rays of sunlight to help our small country. The risk of tech bifurcation as they split will be a big challenge for manufacturers in Singapore. But overall, I think we're well poised to these issues. We will have, therefore, to deal with demands on each side. On the China part, the idea of the Belt and Road, and there's opportunity there. On America's side, there will also be the digital economy, and they will bring in labor issues, human rights, and democracy more and more. A number of companies have already felt this. For example, in nearby Malaysia, rubber glove makers, and our neighbors are the biggest rubber glove makers in the whole world, have had their goods sanctioned and refused entry into the American market, which is a very big one for them. So there will be turbulence, but I do believe that we will be able to steer this through, and in fact, we will find a silver lining on the horizon. I think there's just maybe 1 more slide, is there? Yes. As I mentioned, we partnered with the Emerging Stronger Task Force and put out our own report called New Horizons. We endorsed the idea of the Emerging Stronger Task Force, a virtually unlimited, sustainable nation that is stronger together. Our report then goes on to talk about other issues like the near abroad. How do we strengthen ties with Batam, Bintan as a production base, and also North with Johor? These and other ideas can be found in the report. And again, the QR code is there for you if you should be interested. I'm happy to come back to any of these top line issues, but otherwise, let me let the next poll run and introduce my colleague and good friend, Mr. Satya from KPMG, who's also a council member of the SAA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah.
Hey, Mr. Satya, Prof. Ting, before we start off, we already had the second poll start running. Yep. So probably we will give a few more seconds, for the participants to key in their answers in it.
And Tiffany, we can have the answers maybe later at the start of Q&A. That'd be nice to know what the
Not a
audience
problem.
thinks.
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, and I think we have more or less quite a number of the participants has really keyed in their questions, but probably we'll just give another 5 more seconds for anyone who's reading halfway through. And I think we are quite done with it. So, Prof. Ting, we will share the answers of the results of the 2
What do we do at
questions.
Q&A? Unless Satya wants his now.
Sure. So let me share the results for Mr. Satya questions and stuff. Now everybody should be able to see the polling results.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Okay. Mr. Satya, I shall end my sharing of the polling results.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Tay, and thank you, Tiffany, for inviting us to this session. It's indeed been a pleasure working with SIIA and Prof. Tay on this report. We had the privilege of working with a number of private sector participants in kind of channeling the ideas and solutions back to the EST. What I will do today, building on the earlier comments, is to really share our views on 2 specific areas. If we move to the next slide. First, on technology and digitalization, and where are the opportunities for Singapore enterprises and broadly Singapore. And I'll also cover sustainability and the opportunities with sustainability. We have received some very good questions in the pre-event inputs, so we will answer those either through the presentation or in the end. So, Prof. Tay made a very strong case about technology, digitalization, and sustainability no longer being nice to haves, but rather imperatives as we all look forward to the next decade and more. So in the work that we did for this report, we had to address 2 important questions. One is, what are the key markets that Singapore should be looking at? And our focus was really to ask, should you be very broad or should you be very focused? And as we went through this, what became very clear is Indonesia and Vietnam are 2 key markets, not just because of the size and the opportunity that they present, but also because of the stability that they show generally and have shown over a period of time. And the 2 markets are interesting for different reasons. Indonesia has a very big domestic base, and Vietnam has a very strong international export orientation. And in many ways, both of them can build off the strengths that Singapore has and Singapore enterprises have built over the years. The second important point we wanted to build off is really the fact that Singapore's brand and companies and enterprises in Singapore have the opportunity to build off that brand of trust, reliability, and predictability. When we go into overseas markets, we actually don't realize the value of that. And in the products and services that Singapore and Singapore enterprises can push out, it is very clear that these can be built on to get both increased market share in overseas markets, but also get better pricing and value from our customers. So let me cover some key points on technology and digitalization that we have covered in the report. So if you study the report, you will get a lot more detail. So in this short session, I'll just touch on the key points. The first and very important point that we have seen, and this has been called out quite extensively in the ESG report, and we think this should be built on even more, is the idea that Singapore is a crucible of innovation. And it has always been that we can bring ideas from around the world, we test them in Singapore rapidly, we have the opportunity to look at regulatory sandboxes, which are much harder to test in other countries, and then deliver solutions which can be rapidly scaled across different markets. So let me give you some examples. So today, as we sit here, we're looking at electric vehicles as a key driver of growth in transport. What can Singapore do here? Clearly, some initial steps are being taken around both the intent of moving to electrify the entire transport system and build charging points, 60,000 charging points by 2030. How can enterprises get involved in this? We think that there are a number of ancillary industries where there will be many opportunities to participate. And if Singapore can do this effectively, these solutions can be exported into Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia and Vietnam. And we think that the opportunity here is to not just look at the technology or the customer service, but also to look at regulation and the fact that this is probably a once in a century transition. And likewise, in a number of areas where technology, regulation, and product development come together. Now let's talk about the supply chain ecosystem. Prof. Tay spoke about the significant pressures that have arisen thanks to the global geopolitical contest between China and the US. COVID placed another further stress in terms of localization, where everybody wanted to essentially bring back onshore a number of manufacturing and other activities. But what we've seen is the opportunity here for Singapore to be a reliable and trusted partner to a number of countries in the global supply chain ecosystem. And here, there's an opportunity to further increase and anchor MNC supply chains with a slight difference where parts of the supply chain can be placed in neighborhood countries like the Batam, Bintan, BBK, as well as Johor. And that is one definite big opportunity where Singapore enterprises can participate. But the second big opportunity is that Singapore has already built a strong footprint of business parks, definitely in Vietnam, and increasingly can build it out in Indonesia as well. And once you combine these Singapore assets and build how we can take both products and capabilities across this network, a lot of new things can happen in the supply chain ecosystem. So that is again an area of opportunity, and working between the larger players who run these parks and some of the smaller enterprises who have product and capabilities to take into these markets is clearly an opportunity for businesses. Let's now talk about smart commerce. Smart commerce is increasingly, becoming the way to deliver product and services in ASEAN. And the growth in Indonesia during the COVID time was exponential. And the opportunity here is for Singapore enterprises to participate much more effectively on in this space without the significant marketing and infrastructure costs that come with setting up full-blown offices in these markets. Now, if you take an example of, say, a company like Secret Labs, which actually had significant growth thanks to the quality of its products during COVID, you are able to see how a good quality product with a good smart commerce backend and customer delivery model can scale very, very quickly. So I think that is certainly an area where Singapore enterprises can grow. There is still a lot to be done in terms of both building the logistics and the customs and related infrastructure. But we certainly think that having a clear strategy for e-commerce is a must-have for many Singapore enterprises trying to regionalize into ASEAN. The other area where we think significant progress can be made is with services export. So, for example, during COVID, the work Singapore did through SG Clean and the protocols that were established gave a huge opportunity for Singapore to export some of these capabilities to other countries, both in Southeast Asia and across. And many of the protocols which were used here became very popular in other markets to provide the quality of hygiene and safety that customers were looking for in those markets. Working both with Singapore capabilities and packaging these with skills which may be available in other ASEAN countries in abundant measure, like in Indonesia or Vietnam. Many of you would know technology skills in Vietnam are quite significant. The opportunity to package the brand of Singapore, the high-end skills in technology with the development capabilities that Vietnam may have, can create very strong services brands. And some of them have already been successful. Is really a big opportunity for Singapore. Now, all of this is good, but many of you will say that we have a huge talent crunch. And that talent crunch is definitely not going away anytime soon, partly because of the great resignation, where many people are challenging their own assumptions on work and whether they should be working or taking more time off. There's issues with immigration and people wanting to go back to be closer to their families. So all of that has created significant issues. And so we think the approach is a combination of course, attracting talent into Singapore, but working with neighboring talent pools to build these packages to serve the markets far more effectively. And the last aspect of this is upskilling, because upskilling is definitely something which is needed across a range of domains, partly because of the significant changes that technology is bringing in many businesses, but also because customer service is becoming more and more important in serving customers in a wide range of industries. These skills and these capabilities cannot just be acquired, they have to be worked on over a period of time. And in this regard, there is also a great opportunity for education players in Singapore, which have the brand and the credibility of producing quality results with their students and customers, to take these products and do a hybrid. So we're not saying everything can be done online. There will need to be a hybrid approach to this, to take it into our key markets in ASEAN, build that capability pool, and then work with some of these other ideas to convert them into value for Singapore and Singapore enterprises. Next slide. I'll now briefly talk about the key opportunities in sustainable development. And while many of these are large enterprise solutions and ideas, there is certainly a significant role for small and medium enterprises to contribute and participate in the green economy as well as in the transition. Please understand that this is not just about green economy. This is also about transition to the green economy, which is going to happen not in 5 years or 10 years, but probably over 20 or 30 years. And that's a huge opportunity in and of itself. So let's start with green finance. Green finance is clearly a big opportunity to both fund projects and companies which produce products and services which can qualify as sustainable products. And the ability to use this is significant, partly because we are seeing more and more what is called greenwashing happening. Many investors and many lenders are very concerned about the impact of what might be considered unethical practices in the green supply chain. Recently, we had reports of a country where this is not just green, but sustainable practices not being followed in agriculture and in the production of crops, which were being financed very, very differently. And these are challenges which will continue to come up. And the ability of Singapore to be seen as a safe and trusted hub in green finance is going to enable creating a hub for this finance opportunity. Very related to that is transition finance. As I said, the energy transition is going to happen over a period of time. And in this regard, we are going to see funding required to finance projects which are not necessarily green, but which can enable transition to green over a period of time. And these include projects in the areas like LNG, projects in building out capacity to support various forms of energy transition, including battery technology and so on. And all of this will enable Singapore to play a significant role in financing this infrastructure in the region. Going to carbon trading, again, today the market is small, but based on what we estimate, this sector is going to grow significantly, and the need for verifiable carbon credits by international investors is going to be very, very acute. Singapore again can play a role in this area. Again, the opportunity for finding these credits and offsets in markets in ASEAN is something which enterprises should explore in working in enabling the way they are going to evolve their business models. So to give you an example here, so far Singapore has worked primarily on the basis of land and labor constraints. As we look ahead, Singapore is going to work on the basis of carbon constraints. One of the key constraints of growth is going to be the ability to secure low carbon solutions or pay the price of carbon. And we have been seeing discussions about carbon tax in the budget, and these are going to come in even more strongly going forward. So the ability of enterprises to first understand their carbon footprint, enable them to price them into their product, and address changes to the business model required to be viable becomes a hugely important question. And as you identify the carbon opportunities where you might save carbon, that opens up credits to be traded. We talk about packaging capabilities as a significant opportunity where in Singapore, we have very, very strong capabilities in the public sector. And we also have an ecosystem of private players. The regional markets require integrated solutions. So whether it is in transport, whether it is in infrastructure or other areas, clearly packaging some of these capabilities which the private sector and the public sector have to deliver, to bid for and deliver projects in the region become hugely critical. So we think the opportunity here is to really come together as Singapore Inc. in driving the growth of these opportunities, supported by finance and funding that will be needed to compete with some of the larger players in the region, like China, Korea, or Japan. And finally, the opportunity for infrastructure in capital markets is significant and real. What do we mean by this? There is a lot of infrastructure development required in the region. There is capital available, but there is also a need to validate these projects and price them appropriately for their bankability. Singapore, by bringing more infrastructure assets to capital markets, similar to the way REITs have really enabled the real estate markets to come to life, both from an opportunity of recycling capital, but also for investors and the individual who wants to put their retirement savings into these assets, creates a real big opportunity for Singapore as a hub for infrastructure finance. As projects in different sectors get listed and priced in Singapore, regional markets, which have a large pool of assets, both existing and new, will become more confident to bring these assets to market in Singapore and create a level of vibrancy in the capital markets for Singapore. So these are some of our key recommendations that we've identified in the report. What I'd now like to do is to stop here and we can go into the Q&A. So Tiffany, shall we hand it back to you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Mr. Satya. Okay, and now let us proceed on with the Q&A sessions itself. Okay, and we'll be starting the Q&A session soon. So if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to submit them by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your questions. Do note that as we have limited time for the Q&A session, we will not be able to answer all questions. Thus, we seek your kind understanding that should your questions not be answered during this session, please contact Professor Tay or Mr. Satya directly with their contact details feature on the screen through SIIA or email SCCCI, and we'll forward your inquiries to them too. So now let us welcome back two of our speakers for the Q&A sessions. So over to you, Mr. Satya, and do let me know if you'd like me to do the poll sharing of the results that we have asked previously.
Yes, Tiffany, why don't you go ahead and share the poll result, the first one, of whether how interested people are in ASEAN as opposed to China or India. Oh, good. I'm glad to see that over half our audience find it very important. Because then, if I may, Satya, I'll start with one of the first questions posted by Mr. Daniel Sai. What sectors have more opportunities in Indonesia and Vietnam? Daniel, I want to answer you in this way. As Satya said, our report doesn't really focus on particular sectors. I mean, a lot depends on what your company is doing. What we are pointing to is that these two countries actually have had a degree of stability in different ways. One, a single party state, which has really been quite forward-looking. And Vietnam will also receive a lot of foreign investor demand, and the economy is really heated up. The other way that Indonesia is stable is very different. It's a democracy, something like a very loud democracy. But after a number of transitions, I'd say they really have started to liberalize. So last year, they passed an omnibus bill that really made it foreign investors much easier. They know they have to be more open to the outside world. And it's not just in one or two sectors, but really broad-based. So they're both quite stable and large, and they're both looking outward. The second factor is what I think Satya said as a generational opportunity. If you go there, you will see that the Ibu and Bapas in Indonesia, I mean, they're still there, but there's a whole new generation of very savvy, often Western trained or trained in Singapore graduates. The level of professionalism in Vietnam too has just remarkably gone up. These people have been working very hard. They're very hungry too. So rather than pick out a sector, I would say it depends on your strengths and where you feel you can go. The opportunities are very broad. I'll add one more point, and this is a point I want to emphasize what Sacha said. The need for Singapore in the next stage to really form partnerships. Otherwise, as these countries come up more, you may occupy that space by yourself for a while, but the Vietnamese company will edge you out in Vietnam eventually, or the Indonesian will edge you out in Indonesia. I think, though, that this opportunity is for you to find and look for partners in Indonesia and Vietnam and grow with them to whatever structure of shareholding or you feel comfortable with. Because this will help you navigate. This is the old reason. But more than that, this will align your growth because these two countries are also very nationalistic. They will want, after a while, to have certain key sectors close to their own people. Where you can, of course, show a value added is your ability to get finance and know the market of Singapore. The paths, if you are strong at it, on sustainability and digital, can also be ways to have enduring value added to the partners you find in Indonesia or Vietnam.
Thanks, Simon. If I may respond to some of the earlier questions which were asked, if it's okay, should I put that up? One of the questions really which was asked was with China is still a prime mover, which countries in ASEAN are the most suitable to find partnerships and opportunities in the context of ASEAN-China economic links? I think you've kind of answered that, Simon, more or less. So I think unless there are any further comments, we can move on to the next question. The next question is, what ASEAN country offers the most opportunities for businesses? And I think, if I may, we covered it again with, say, Indonesia and Vietnam and the near abroad, Singapore, near Singapore in Johor and BBK. Philippines and Myanmar are large markets, but really, we think in the short term, there are challenges politically in both those markets. Simon, is there anything else?
Yes, I wanted to add, of course, about the China question. And of course, any foreign investor looking at ASEAN, maybe I'm too Singaporean, but I want to emphasize, I feel there's a value in working through Singapore. Some people do it already. The Japanese do it in a very big way, the Europeans and Americans. Some, like Korea, have tended to go direct. So if Korea is interested in Thailand, they go direct, or Vietnam, they go direct there. Taiwanese also being very sort of bold. I believe that there's a lot of value for China to hub in Singapore and go out into the region. And there's a lot of times where, you look at it's happening today. We have not just your Googles and Facebook, we have also your Tencents and Huawei's in Singapore. And oftentimes, China companies, they struggle to understand the various different markets in ASEAN. And Singapore can be a good interlocutor. In other partnerships too, I would say that what we're trying to carry on from Singapore is not just like a hub for airport and logistics. It's also trying to partner Singapore companies, maybe try some innovation here and then roll out into the bigger ASEAN markets around us. So I think that's one way to look at China dealing with ASEAN. Of course, into the factories, unless it's a really rare factory like Hyundai putting a small factory in Singapore, I don't think it makes much sense. It's a low cost. But there may be ways to link that advanced value chain to have certain more advanced products here in Singapore, or the data centers, etc., in Singapore, and then other value chains out into the wider region. Thank
you, Simon. I'll put up a question here from Mr. Chu Ningzi. The trade question of how a China player can exploit the ASEAN market. And the question is really partly for SCCCI on that forum to create for the ASEAN market. But maybe the first question is really, I think it's important to understand what is your value proposition to ASEAN. And accordingly, we think you should work on those markets which have the biggest opportunity. So are you a consumer product? And if so, Indonesia is a huge consumer market. And do you have a certain value proposition to that customer base, which can be entered? The other important point which was highlighted was partnerships. These markets are very contextual. So having a local partner is, or to understand and navigate the country is quite critical. There are many entry points. Do you enter in Jakarta? Do you enter in Surabaya? Do you enter in another island is again a very big question. Of course, everybody wants to enter through Java and Jakarta, but that may not be the best strategy for your product or your service. If you're a tech company who's trying to build a tech pool, maybe you should go into Bandung, for example. So these are all very contextual matters where you can get the right partners to support. And finally, we think that if you have a very good value proposition and you have a strong team, support from government is probably not difficult once you've articulated what you can deliver in terms of growth and value, as many companies have shown. Okay, then maybe moving on to next question, which I think is for you, Prof. Teh. There are stability issues within ASEAN economies due to volatile political climes, and businesses don't want to get caught in limbo if they enter these markets. This is not in the, this is from the earlier chat. How do we address these concerns?
Yes. Well, thank you, Satya. I think that's a very good question. I was quite optimistic about the opening, and I remain so. But even then, I must warn you, there will be some policy wobbling. As the numbers come up, there will always be some demands to say, alarm. For example, Singapore's numbers have jumped in the last 48 hours to numbers we've not seen before. But I think in this case, for us as a small controlled space, we have more or less prepared for it. And I don't think, in fact, I think it's more the reverse, that we're going to start to loosen up even more. And so the first step has been today's announcement. We've seen this coming. The rest of the countries, I'm not so certain. For example, I said that last November, countries committed to opening. They did. But then as the numbers climbed, people like Thailand started to be a bit nervous and closed back again. And now they've opened again. So I think the overall direction is there, but like a sailcraft or a drunken driver, they're not actually going to get there straight and consistently. They're traveling in that direction. And the broader question of stability is also the same. I don't say that Indonesia is forever stable, but I think the next 18 months, the sort of near to middle term, can be very dynamic because Pak Jokowi has cobbled together a platform, a cabinet that has included even his former opponents. So they have the numbers and they're very hungry to do international investment deals. They need it. They need to create jobs for the young people. And this will create the economic happiness that can then have the basis for the next election. Now, traditionally in Indonesia, about 1 year out or less, electioneering starts so strongly that the past president, well, he's not passed yet, but he's treated like the past president, if you know what I mean. So in the sense, there is a kind of shortening window of opportunity in Indonesia. I wouldn't rush too much if you haven't got a good partner, but if you've been looking for things for some time, there is a season to these choices, and you may want to look at that portfolio again and make your own decision. Now, I think Satya put it well that that other countries like Myanmar are facing a very clear near-term problem. In fact, it could be a longer problem. I have one more question in the box about Thailand. Thailand is a difficult country at this point. There is a seeming stability, but there is a fighting within the ruling coalition and the party that backs the Prime Minister Prayut. He himself barely won, the majority last time. So this coalition inter-party politics might be enough to soften him. Also, there's always this question mark about the Reds and Kun Thaksin, who remains a certain core following, and that's not a resolved issue. Thailand's a very attractive market, more mature in some ways, more expensive in some ways than Indonesia or Vietnam. It has a value, but I think for various reasons, as I've said, we haven't strongly emphasized as much as we see Indonesia and Vietnam.
Thank you, Simon. This question from Richard Bullock, who talks about what role will Singapore play in India's future economic growth? This seems like an even bigger opportunity than ASEAN.
Yes, why don't you go first, Sacha?
Yeah, if I may, I think this is a very good question, and I think this was obviously one of the key things to when SM Go had in those days talked about looking to India. I think the big opportunity in India, interestingly, for Singapore and Singapore enterprises is twofold. One is really how do you exploit the very high quality labor market pool to serve international markets with the Singapore brand. So we think that that is one way of taking advantage of India's resources and capabilities by building, by almost exploiting the labor market efficiently and providing products and services which you might deliver. And this is particularly in services industry, which is what some very large US multinationals have done, which is really go in and put a lot of the technology and back office into India. So Singapore should do that because there's a lot of interest in working with Singapore on that bridge. The second bridge, which is very significant, is Singapore, Indian companies and governments are dealing with serious urban issues. And Singapore has solved many urban problems or at least developed solutions which are very viable in dealing with sanitation, health, congestion, and beginning to address sustainability questions. India is facing all of these issues. So if you're a company which works on, let's say, the transport sector, you've developed technology which reduces the carbon footprint in, say, road laying, that would be very interesting to India. Likewise, if you've developed solutions where you can take in other urban solution areas like water or waste, those would be very interesting. So we see these two as big areas. Now, in consumer products, the question is, what's the unique proposition? And if it is, then clearly it's something to look at. But again, it's about entry point because India is a huge market, and like China, it's all about knowing how to play there and finding the right partnerships. So, Simon, should we move on to the...
I add one point about India. I would say that while going into the Indian market is challenging, and the counsel, the general advice that Sacha gives is good, one other element is, of course, to look at how India is also quite selectively coming into our region. In Singapore's trust factor and hub sector, which Sacha mentioned, enjoys a very high reputation in India. So if Indian companies, the bigger scale ones, are looking at opportunities in our region, they will look and I think quite be open to working out from Singapore and then trying to partner them here. So going into India is a whole universe of issues, but India coming out into ASEAN, I think is a smaller frame of opportunities and also challenges. Different one.
The next question, thank you, Prof. Tay. The next question is really, what are the barriers in ASEAN countries that hinder the export of Singapore products, and how can an SME with limited resources overcome them?
If I could start on that one, Satya.
Yeah.
As you know, the ASEAN Economic Community has been inaugurated since 2015, and tariffs have been reduced significantly, almost close to zero for most goods. There remain, of course, some obstacles. Sometimes they are bureaucratic. Some countries do not have electronic data documentation systems. They still, I mean, maybe 5 years ago, I hope they're gone, but 5 years ago, you could find various border posts where people have to type in carbon copies before importing anything. So this is slowly going. The trade facilitation is increasing, and a lot of times they're using a Singapore sort of blueprint of how to do this electronic documentation to really help the single window approach to trade documentation, etc. The naughty problem is the non-tariff measures about sometimes safety or food quality issues, the stamp of whether this is certified. That one is tougher, especially if you're on the pharmaceuticals or food sector. They're very particular. If you are more in electronics or other more sort of global supply chain issues, then it's more standardized. So I think that's about as far as I can get with that question, unless something specific in mind. Satya, anything to add?
No, I think that's probably, unless we go to the specifics of the sector there and what those challenges are.
If you're a genuine SME from Singapore, I mean, in the sense that you are Singapore-based, and I find that not perfect, but ESG has been trying to help the SMEs solve this problem. So if there are particular problems, perhaps they try them, your taxpayer.
Yeah. There are a couple of questions which we can take together. One is, how can we enable web marketing to work better for ASEAN? And in view of the pandemic crisis, which is on the screen, and the rise of the opportunity in digital economy, what advice would you recommend in SG to seize the market in ASEAN? So here I can take that. I think one of the important things to understand is, firstly, you need to understand the markets. For example, in some countries like Myanmar, it's Facebook stores. In others like Indonesia, it's a tie-up between physical and online stores. So in some countries, mobile is very, very high penetration. So firstly, you really need to understand what's the lay of the land in terms of how do consumers look at buying product or service. Then you got to build the internet infrastructure, which is to support it in your organization. You got to also understand and align the online marketing regulatory environment around privacy, around data. You can get tripped up if you're not careful about that. And then really, we need to look at how you develop the local marketplace in terms of an online marketplace. And I know we've seen some players who've been very, very successful in that, like Shopee and so on, who've grown to be regional players. But very, very importantly, as you go into these markets, do not underestimate the need to recruit and train local talent. Because having local talent not only helps you with your resources at a lower cost, very importantly, they are possible consumers of your product. And they can give you a lot of input into what will sell or what will work, what kind of campaign will be effective in those markets. So we think that those are some important things. And then going to the specifics on the startups, we really think that the venture scene in Singapore is better than it ever was so far. And really working with mentors who can help you find the right way to build out your idea is one aspect, and then finding the right funding to back it is the next step. So we think the environment is much as good as it has ever been in Singapore for you to start doing this, and then connecting with all those other points about building your ASEAN connectivity and presence, and thinking through those become an important consideration. Okay, so maybe we move on to the next question. And I think, Prof, this has come up a couple of times. It seems like there's a need for SIIA to actually develop a platform to connect with foreign counterparts. And the same question was asked by the gentleman from China. So I think the question is really, is SIIA able to bring people who are ASEAN minded and want to grow in ASEAN together, which is maybe something you want to answer?
Yes, I also listen that we are running out of time, Satya. So if I may, I'll just offer that answer and then some closing thoughts, and then pass back my microphone to you and then to Tiffany. Okay. So first, as I try to introduce the SIIA, there are many things we do, but we are a public policy, not for profit think tank. And that's why we're very happy to work with SCCCI, and we will work with other chamber partners, because we feel that they have the business audience, they have the business networks and platform where you can bring the information and insights in, but we are not into the matchmaking business. We do have membership. Our members tend to be larger companies. Some are Singaporean, like UOB Bank. Some are Temasek linked companies like Keppel. Others are foreign, like Mitsubishi or Citibank, or European companies, etc. And really, sometimes they do find projects that they meet in our talks, and then they walk off into the sunset together, hopefully happily. But that's not an active thing that we consciously do for all companies. We're just not built that way. We do advisory work. So we have done for various multinationals much deeper looks at the domestic politics in certain sectors, try to look at what the energy pricing might be in Indonesia, the corruption laws of Thailand, etc. So we have some capability that would help companies. But in a way, that's one reason I'm very happy to be here, partnering Satya, my friend from KPMG, without advertising them or the other advisory firms. That's where they do much more real business relevant consulting and advisory work. And we kind of see the roles as being a bit different between the chambers or matchmaking partnerships with businesses, the business advisory, and as I said about SIIA, the politics and political policy, but it does focus on what's relevant to business. So there were, for example, a few questions in the Q&A that asked me about, say, the South China Sea. On another day, in one of our talks on South China Sea, I'm happy to talk to you about it. We do look at it, but we don't look at it as much as we do about whether China should be investing in Vietnam, what will Americans think, that kind of issues. I hope that's an okay closer, and I want to pass the microphone back to Satya.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Tay. I just have one question which I'm really tempted to answer, which is around electric vehicles. What is the anticipated pace of ASEAN to adopt electric vehicles, especially for commercial use? Primarily because this is definitely a big opportunity. We spoke about it in our remarks. We think the two markets which are most advanced in this area are Singapore and Thailand, actually, interestingly. Partly because Singapore has shown significant political ambition and commitment to grow the market here. And Thailand because, interestingly, players like PTT, who are the energy utility, has taken some very, very interesting actions to move forward and grow in this space. So those are two markets to watch out for. Now, when you look at Vietnam and Indonesia, these are actually what we would call the middle of the pack with regard to the pace of development, and for very different reasons. Indonesia, because it's got resources. They've got all the key resources in islands which can be converted into battery technology. And so the Chinese are partnering aggressively with Indonesian companies to go and build out battery plants and similar things. So the idea being, we want to be the supplier to all of the EVs. And that's an Indonesian ambition of value-added to resources and minerals, which has been a long-standing ambition for Indonesia as a country. And now it's being translated through some of their SOEs where they have set up and integrated many of these companies. Now, when it comes to Vietnam, it's a slightly different thing. Vietnam has a huge population of two-wheelers, and the opportunity there is about solving the EV problem for two-wheelers. How do we get more electric two-wheelers, and battery swapping and other things become hugely interesting for that market. So that's a very quick response to that question. But I think with that, I would probably say that there are a number of questions still on the thing, and I'm sure we can come back later, but we'll pass it back to Tiffany. Yeah.
And sure, thank you, Mr. Satya, and thank you, Prof. Tay. A big thank you to both of our speakers for their valuable time and sharings. Okay, and we hope that you have, for the participants, you have benefited a lot from the webinar session. Now, before we end off, for those of you who would like to receive a copy of the following reports by SIIA, as shown on the screen, please scan on the QR code feature on the screen right now, or look up for our post email to download a copy of it. Now, lastly, just a gentle reminder to complete the feedback form. For those of you who are ending off this session, just remember to help us to complete the feedback form by clicking on the link that will appear after you leave the session. Your feedback is crucial for us as it will allow us to tailor more meaningful events for you in future. Now, we look forward to seeing everyone again in our future events. Thank you, stay safe, and goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Tay. Thank you, Mr. Satya.